Some men say the frontier keeps its secrets buried under dust and silence, but every once in a while a man sees something he was never meant to see, and the choice he makes in the next few seconds can change more lives than he could ever imagine. Ethan Calloway had ridden the same stretch of desert trail a dozen times that summer, a lonely ribbon of dirt winding through Redstone Hills nearly 40 miles from the nearest settlement, a place where the wind spoke louder than any human voice and the sun hung heavy in a sky that never seemed to end. He was guiding his horse along the edge of a narrow canyon when he saw her. At first, she looked like a shadow moving between the rocks, quiet and steady, the kind of movement that belonged to the land itself rather than to a traveler passing through it. Then the sunlight caught the silver beads woven into her dark hair, and Ethan realized she was a young native woman walking alone along a path that led straight toward the place every rancher in 3 counties knew to avoid. The locals called it Red Mesa Hollow, a valley hidden between towering cliffs where stories said no outsider was welcome and no white man should ever set foot. Most men would have turned their horse the other way the moment they saw someone heading there, but Ethan felt something he couldn't quite explain settle in his chest. The woman walked with calm purpose, neither hurried nor afraid, as if the land itself recognized her steps. She carried no rifle, no saddlebag, no sign that she feared the miles of wilderness surrounding her. And yet what caught Ethan most was the moment she paused on the ridge above the hollow and glanced back across the desert. Their eyes met from nearly 100 yards away, and for just a heartbeat the wind seemed to stop moving across the valley floor. There was no surprise in her gaze, no alarm at seeing a cowboy sitting tall in the saddle behind her. Instead, she studied him with the quiet certainty of someone who had expected him to appear. Then she turned and continued down the narrow trail that slipped between 2 towering walls of stone, the entrance to the Forbidden Valley. Ethan felt the reins tighten slightly in his gloved hand, as his horse shifted beneath him. Every warning he had ever heard echoed in his mind. Ranch hands had traded stories about Red Mesa Hollow around campfires for years. Some claimed the land belonged to the Apache. Others said it was sacred ground older than any tribe or town. Whatever the truth was, every man agreed on one thing. Outsiders stayed away. Ethan sat there for a long moment watching the trail swallow the last glimpse of the woman. The desert wind brushed across his coat, and the distant cry of a hawk circled somewhere high above the cliffs. A sensible man would have turned back toward the open plains and forgotten the whole thing before sundown. But Ethan Calloway had never been especially good at pretending curiosity did not exist. He nudged his horse forward, guiding it toward the narrow path that led into the shadow of the cliffs, following the quiet footsteps of the woman who had walked into the Forbidden Valley, as if she already knew he would come after her. Ethan Calloway guided his horse slowly down the narrow trail that slipped between the towering red cliffs, and with every step the world behind him seemed to fade away until the open desert felt like a distant memory. The air inside the canyon was cooler, touched by a faint scent of sage and damp stone, and the wind that had followed him across the plains could no longer reach the ground here. The only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves against packed earth and the soft creak of leather from the saddle beneath him. Somewhere ahead on the winding path the native woman continued walking, her footsteps light enough that he could barely hear them, yet every so often he caught a glimpse of her figure rounding a bend between the rocks. She did not hurry. She did not look back again. It was as if she knew the distance between them down to the last yard and trusted that he would keep following. Ethan could not explain why he did. The stories he had heard around ranch fires returned to him one by one. Old cattle drivers had warned that the hollow ahead belonged to people who respected the land in ways settlers rarely understood. A few men claimed it was sacred ground, a place where outsiders brought nothing but trouble by crossing the unseen boundary that surrounded the valley. Ethan had laughed at those stories once, the way young men do when they believe the frontier belongs to whoever rides through it with confidence. Now, riding beneath cliffs that rose more than 200 feet above him on either side, he found himself wondering whether those stories had carried more truth than he had given them credit for. The trail curved again and the canyon opened slightly, revealing a narrow stream no wider than 10 feet, winding through smooth stones polished by years of quiet water. The woman stood there waiting on the opposite bank. She had stopped beside a cottonwood tree that leaned out over the stream, its leaves shimmering silver in the afternoon sun filtering through the canyon walls. Ethan reined in his horse about 30 yards away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt older than the land itself, patient and watchful. Then the woman stepped carefully across the stones in the shallow water and walked toward him. Up close, Ethan could see that she carried herself with a calm confidence that most frontier men never managed to learn. Her dark eyes studied him with the same quiet certainty he had seen earlier on the ridge. "You have come farther than most would dare," she said in clear English that carried only the slightest trace of an accent shaped by another language. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the saddle horn and nodded once. "I suppose curiosity can be stronger than common sense sometimes." The corners of her mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to it. "This land is not meant for visitors," she said, glancing briefly toward the deeper canyon ahead where the path disappeared into shadow again. "Many men hear the warnings and still believe they are different from the others who came before them." Ethan looked past her toward the hidden valley that waited beyond the next turn in the canyon. The sunlight there was softer, almost golden, and something about the place felt strangely peaceful despite the reputation that surrounded it. "Maybe I am not different," he said quietly. "Maybe I just saw someone walking into a place no one else dared to go alone." The woman watched him for another long moment as the leaves above them rustled softly in the still air. Then she turned toward the deeper canyon and began walking again, her voice drifting back over her shoulder as naturally as the wind that had vanished from the desert behind them. "If you continue past this stream, Cowboy, there will be no turning back before nightfall." The woman continued deeper into the canyon without waiting to see whether Ethan would follow, her steps steady along the narrow path that curved between the redstone walls. Ethan sat quietly in the saddle for a moment beside the shallow stream, listening to the soft movement of water over smooth stones and the distant whisper of wind high above the cliffs where the sky formed a thin ribbon of blue. Her warning lingered in his mind. There will be no turning back before nightfall. It was not spoken as a threat. It sounded more like a simple truth of the land ahead. Ethan guided his horse across the stream, the animal stepping carefully through the cool water before climbing the opposite bank. The canyon grew quieter the farther he rode. Even the usual sounds of birds and insects seemed to fade, replaced by a deep stillness that settled over the valley like a held breath. The trail widened slightly after another quarter mile, revealing patches of tall grass and clusters of desert flowers that somehow thrived in the shadow of the cliffs. Ethan spotted the woman again walking several yards ahead, her dark hair shifting gently with each step. She moved with the kind of calm confidence that suggested she had walked this path many times before. After a while she slowed her pace and allowed him to ride beside her. They traveled that way for several minutes without speaking, the quiet between them filled only by the soft crunch of gravel beneath hooves and boots. Finally she glanced toward him with a thoughtful expression. "Most men would have turned around by now," she said. Ethan looked ahead toward the bend where the canyon curved out of sight. "Most men probably have more sense than I do." She studied him for a moment as though weighing something in her thoughts. "What is your name, Cowboy?" "Ethan Calloway," he answered. "I run cattle about 30 miles west of here near Cottonwood Ridge." "And you?" She walked a few more steps before replying. "My name is Iana Redhawk." The name carried a quiet strength that seemed to belong to the land itself. Ethan repeated it once under his breath as if committing it to memory. The canyon widened again after another half-mile, opening into a hidden valley surrounded by towering stone ridges that rose nearly 300 feet on every side. Sunlight poured into the basin like warm gold, illuminating a clear lake at the center where the water reflected the sky so perfectly that it looked like a mirror placed in the desert. Ethan slowed his horse and took in the sight. He had ridden across thousands of acres of rough country during his years on the frontier, yet he had never seen a place that felt quite like this one. It was peaceful in a way that made the outside world feel distant and unimportant. Iana stopped near the edge of the lake and turned to face him fully for the first time since they entered the canyon. There was a calm seriousness in her eyes that made Ethan sit a little straighter in the saddle. "You asked earlier why I did not send you away," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "I did wonder about that." Iana looked across the surface of the lake where the reflection of the cliffs shimmered gently in the afternoon light. Because sometimes a man does not arrive in a place by accident, she said. Sometimes the land itself brings him here when the time is right. Ethan followed her gaze across the quiet water, unsure whether she meant the words as a mystery or as something much simpler. Either way, he felt the strange sense again that the path he had chosen that afternoon might have been waiting for him long before he ever set foot on it. The surface of the lake remained perfectly still as the afternoon sun drifted lower behind the cliffs, casting long bands of amber light across the valley floor. Ethan Calloway sat quietly in the saddle, studying the reflection of the sky on the water, while Ayanna Redhawk stood a few steps ahead of him near the shore. The place felt untouched by time, as though the outside world with its ranches, towns, and restless travelers had never found its way into this hidden basin. For a while neither of them spoke. Ethan listened to the gentle rustle of tall grass along the water and the faint splash of a trout, somewhere beneath the mirror-like surface. Then he noticed something that had escaped him at first. Along the far edge of the valley, just beyond a line of cottonwood trees, stood several tall wooden poles rising nearly 15 feet into the air. Each pole was carved with patterns that caught the sunlight in quiet shapes of shadow. Ethan leaned forward slightly in the saddle to look more closely. Totem markers. Old ones. Weathered by years of wind and sun, yet still standing straight, as if guarding the valley itself. Ayanna noticed where his attention had drifted and gave a small nod. "You see them now?" she said softly. Ethan studied the carvings for another moment before turning his gaze back to her. "This place means something important to your people." "It is older than my people," she replied calmly. "The valley was respected long before my tribe first walked through these canyons." Ethan removed his hat and rested it against the saddle horn, letting the warm breeze brush through his hair. "Back where I come from, land usually belongs to whoever fences it first." Ayanna looked toward the towering cliffs that surrounded the basin on every side. "Here the land belongs only to itself. That is why outsiders are warned to stay away." Ethan glanced again at the tall poles across the valley and then toward the narrow canyon they had ridden through earlier. "I imagine your people would not be pleased to see a rancher wandering around in the middle of it." Ayanna did not answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer to the lake and crouched near the water, trailing her fingers across the surface so lightly that the ripples spread outward in gentle circles. When she spoke again, her voice carried the quiet patience of someone who understood more than she intended to say. "The people who protect this valley already know you are here." Ethan straightened slightly in the saddle. He had expected the possibility, but hearing it spoken aloud stirred a new awareness in the still air around him. He looked toward the ridge lines that crowned the cliffs nearly 300 feet above the valley floor. The sunlight there shimmered across the rocks, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw movement along the high edge of the canyon. Perhaps it was only the shifting shadows of the evening light. Perhaps not. He returned, his gaze to Ayanna. "And they are allowing me to stay." Ayanna rose slowly to her feet and faced him again. For now, her eyes studied him with the same thoughtful calm she had carried since the moment they met. "The question is not whether you were allowed to enter this place. The question is why you were meant to find it." Ethan looked out across the quiet lake once more as the golden reflection of the sky began to soften with the coming evening. Somewhere deep inside him, he sensed that the answer she hinted at had little to do with curiosity or chance. And for the first time since he had turned his horse toward the canyon hours earlier, he began to understand that the path which brought him into the hidden valley might have been waiting long before he ever chose to follow it. The evening light settled gently across the hidden valley as the sun drifted closer to the rim of the western cliffs, painting the tall stone walls in shades of copper and gold. Ethan Calloway remained seated in his saddle near the quiet edge of the lake, while Ayanna Redhawk stood a few yards away watching the slow movement of the water. The air carried the faint scent of warm earth and cottonwood leaves, and for a long moment the valley seemed so peaceful that it was difficult to imagine the warnings that surrounded this place beyond the canyon. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You said earlier that sometimes a man does not arrive in a place by accident." Ayanna turned her head slightly toward him. "Yes." Ethan studied her expression carefully. "Are you saying that you expected me to follow you here?" Ayanna walked a few steps along the lake shore, her boots brushing through the tall grass that swayed softly in the evening breeze. When she answered, Her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had considered the question long before it was asked. "I did not know the moment would happen today," she said, "but I knew it would happen someday." Ethan leaned forward slightly in the saddle. "That sounds like you were talking about destiny." Ayana paused near a smooth stone that rested half buried in the earth and looked back at him. "In my people's stories, we do not call it destiny. We call it the moment when two paths that have been traveling for many years finally cross." Ethan removed his gloves and rested them across the saddle horn, thinking about the miles of land he had crossed in his life without ever imagining that a path might lead somewhere like this. "You make it sound as if my path has been heading toward this valley for a long time." Ayana nodded once. "Longer than you realize." She stepped closer to the water again and lifted a small object from the leather cord that rested around her neck. The pendant caught the fading sunlight and flashed briefly with a soft reflection across the surface of the lake. Ethan noticed the shape immediately. It was a small piece of polished turquoise wrapped carefully in silver wire. Something about it stirred a distant memory he could not place. "My grandmother wore this stone before she gave it to me," Ayana said quietly. "She was a healer for our people many years ago." Ethan looked more closely at the pendant. "My mother used to talk about a healer who saved her life when she was very young," he said slowly. "She said the woman came from a tribe that lived somewhere near the southern mesas." Ayana studied his face as he spoke, as if waiting to see whether the memory would connect on its own. "Your mother once traveled through these lands when she was a girl," she said. "She became very sick during that journey. My grandmother was the one who helped her recover." Ethan felt a strange stillness settle in his chest. "My mother never knew the name of the woman who helped her." Ayana gently closed her hand around the turquoise pendant. "My grandmother believed that the land sometimes remembers kindness long after the people involved have gone their separate ways. She told me that one day the family she helped would return to this valley without even realizing why they were drawn here." Ethan looked out across the quiet water again as the last light of the sun brushed the tops of the cliffs. Ayana's voice softened as she spoke the final thought. "When I saw you riding across the ridge this afternoon, Cowboy, I knew that the two paths my grandmother spoke about had finally found each other." The last glow of sunlight faded slowly across the high cliffs as the valley settled into the quiet blue light of evening. Ethan Calloway sat motionless in the saddle while Ayana Redhawk stood near the edge of the lake with the turquoise pendant resting in her hand. The story she had just told lingered in the air between them like the final note of a distant song. For several long seconds Ethan did not speak. He looked across the still water, trying to imagine his mother as a young woman traveling through lands she rarely spoke about, meeting people whose names had faded into memory over the years. Finally, he drew a slow breath. "My mother always said someone saved her life when she was young," he said quietly. "She never knew the name of the woman who helped her. She only said that the woman carried a stone the color of the desert sky." Ayana lifted the pendant slightly, and the fading light reflected softly from the turquoise surface. "My grandmother believed that kindness creates its own path through time," she replied. "Sometimes it travels farther than the people who first carried it." Ethan nodded slowly as the meaning settled in his mind. Somewhere above the valley a hawk circled across the darkening sky, and the first evening breeze moved through the cottonwood trees near the lake. For a moment the valley returned to silence again. Then Ethan noticed something new. It was not a sound exactly, more like the quiet feeling that the land around them had become aware of something important. Ayana noticed it too. She turned her gaze toward the ridgeline where the last light of day touched the upper rocks nearly 300 feet above the valley floor. Ethan followed her eyes. At first he saw nothing. Then, one by one, shapes began to appear along the crest of the cliffs. Figures standing quietly against the fading sky. They did not move or raise their voices. They simply stood there, watching the valley below with calm patience. Ethan counted nearly a dozen silhouettes spaced along the ridge. Each figure remained perfectly still, outlined by the last silver band of twilight. He felt no sudden fear in their presence, only a growing awareness that the people who protected this place had chosen to reveal themselves. Ayana stepped beside him and rested her hands loosely at her sides. "They have been watching since you crossed the stream," she said calmly. Ethan kept his eyes on the ridge. "I suspected as much." Ayana glanced toward him. They wanted to see what kind of man would follow a stranger into land he had been warned to avoid. Ethan gave a quiet half-smile. I suppose they have had enough time to decide. The wind moved gently through the valley grass as the silhouettes above remained silent and steady. After a moment, one of the figures stepped forward along the ridgeline. The movement was slow and deliberate, not threatening, but purposeful. The figure raised one arm slightly, not in command, but in greeting that carried across the distance without a single word spoken. Ethan felt the quiet weight of the moment settle over the valley. Ayanna watched the figure with calm recognition and then turned back toward Ethan. My people believe that when two old stories finally meet, the land itself bears witness, she said softly. Tonight the valley is watching to see what the next chapter will become. The figure on the ridgeline lowered his arm slowly after the quiet gesture, and the silhouettes beside him remained still against the fading sky. Evening had settled fully into the valley now, and the last glow of sunlight had disappeared behind the western cliffs, leaving the basin bathed in a calm silver light from the rising moon. Ethan Calloway watched the line of figures carefully, his posture relaxed in the saddle, even though he knew every movement he made was being observed from nearly 300 feet above. The men along the ridge did not rush or speak. They simply began to move along the edge of the canyon wall with the steady patience of people who understood the land beneath their feet. After a moment, Ethan noticed the narrow trail that curved down the far side of the ridge, a path he had not seen earlier from the valley floor. One by one the figures disappeared along that descending route, their silhouettes fading into the deeper shadows of the canyon. Ayanna Redhawk followed their movement with quiet familiarity. They are coming down into the valley, she said calmly. Ethan gave a small nod. I thought they might. The breeze moved softly across the lake again, sending faint ripples across the water where the reflection of the moon began to shimmer like pale silver glass. Ethan slid down from the saddle and let his horse graze in the tall grass nearby. Standing on the ground beside Ayanna made the valley feel even larger, the towering cliffs rising like silent guardians around them. For several minutes, nothing else happened. Then faint shapes appeared along the far side of the basin where the descending trail met the valley floor. A group of riders emerged slowly from the shadow of the canyon wall, their horses moving at a calm walking pace as they crossed the open grass toward the lake. The sound of hooves was soft and unhurried, blending naturally with the night air. Ethan counted nearly a dozen riders, the same number he had seen standing along the ridge earlier. They formed a loose line several yards from the water and brought their horses to a stop. No one reached for a weapon or raised their voice. The moment felt less like a confrontation and more like the quiet arrival of witnesses to something that had been unfolding long before sunset. The rider who had stepped forward on the ridgeline earlier guided his horse a few steps closer to Ethan and Ayanna. He was an older man with silver strands woven through his dark hair, his posture straight and composed as he studied Ethan with steady eyes that carried both wisdom and patience. Ayanna inclined her head slightly in greeting. Ethan understood at once that this man held a place of deep respect among the people who protected the valley. The elder allowed the silence to linger for several seconds before speaking. His voice was calm and measured, carrying easily across the still water beside them. Many years ago a traveler came through these lands seeking help for a sickness she could not overcome alone. Ethan felt a quiet stirring of recognition in his chest, but remained silent, allowing the man to continue. The elder glanced briefly toward the turquoise pendant resting against Ayanna's chest, and then returned his gaze to Ethan. My mother was the healer who helped that traveler recover, he said. She told us the woman carried kindness in her heart and gratitude in her spirit. She also told us that someday the family of that traveler would return to this valley, though they would not understand why their path had brought them here. The elder studied Ethan's face with thoughtful calm. Tonight it seems the path has completed its circle. The elder's words settled gently across the quiet valley as the riders remained still beside the lake, their horses breathing softly in the cool night air. Ethan Calloway stood beside Ayanna Redhawk and felt the weight of the moment settle deeper than anything he had experienced on the frontier before. The silver light of the moon reflected across the water, and the tall canyon walls rose around them like silent witnesses to a story that had begun long before Ethan had ever ridden near these lands. The elders studied Ethan carefully, not with suspicion, but with the calm patience of someone who had already seen enough years to recognize the meaning behind small events. Many seasons have passed since that traveler left this valley, the elder continued. Yet my mother always believed that kindness does not disappear when people part ways. It moves quietly through time until it finds its way home again. Ethan removed his hat slowly and held it against his chest, a gesture of respect that came naturally even though no one had asked it of him. My mother never forgot the woman who helped her, he said quietly. She used to say that if she ever found her again, she would spend the rest of her life trying to repay that kindness. The elder nodded once, as if the answer confirmed something he had long suspected. My mother never asked for repayment, he replied calmly. She believed that kindness should move freely, the way water moves through a valley. But she also believed that the families touched by such moments would one day meet again. Ayana stepped forward slightly, and the turquoise pendant at her neck caught the moonlight with a faint blue glow. My grandmother said that when that day came, we would know it by the way the land felt when the two paths crossed again, she said softly. Ethan glanced around the quiet basin. The air was still, the lake calm, and the presence of the riders nearby carried no sense of tension or challenge. Instead, it felt as though the valley itself had been waiting patiently for this meeting. The elder guided his horse a few steps closer until he stood only a few yards from Ethan. From this distance, Ethan could see the deep lines of age around the man's eyes, the kind that come from many years spent watching both the land and the people who moved through it. My mother kept one small token from the traveler she helped all those years ago, the elder said. She said it would remind our people that the outside world still carried hearts capable of kindness. The elder reached slowly into the leather pouch tied beside his saddle and withdrew a small object wrapped carefully in soft cloth. He unfolded the cloth with deliberate care and held the object out in the moonlight. Ethan felt a quiet jolt of recognition the moment he saw it. It was a silver bracelet, simple in design but worn smooth by many years of travel. The shape was unmistakable. My mother used to wear that bracelet every day, Ethan said in a low voice filled with surprise. She told me she lost it during a long journey through the mesas when she was young. The elder gave a faint smile that carried both warmth and memory. My mother kept it safe all these years, he said. She believed the day would come when it should return to the family that once carried it across these lands. The valley fell silent again as the elder extended the bracelet toward Ethan beneath the pale light of the moon. The elder held the silver bracelet in the moonlight for several quiet seconds before Ethan Calloway finally stepped forward to receive it. The metal felt cool and familiar in his hand, its smooth edges shaped by years of wear that connected the past to the moment standing quietly beside the lake. Ethan turned the bracelet slowly between his fingers and could almost hear his mother's voice again, the way she used to tell stories beside the fireplace during long winter evenings at their ranch. She had spoken of the journey that nearly took her life, and of a woman she never forgot, a healer who asked nothing in return except that kindness should always be passed forward when the chance appeared. Ethan lifted his eyes from the bracelet and looked at the elder with calm respect. My mother searched for this for many years, he said softly. She always hoped she might find it again someday, not because it was valuable, but because it reminded her that someone she had never met chose compassion instead of turning away. The elder nodded slowly as the riders behind him remained still beneath the silver glow of the moon. My mother believed that stories like this must come full circle before they can rest, he replied. The land remembers the people who move across it, and sometimes it guides them back to the places where their stories first began. Ethan slipped the bracelet carefully around his wrist, the metal fitting naturally as though it had been waiting for this moment as long as the valley itself. Beside him, Ayana Redhawk watched quietly, the turquoise pendant at her neck reflecting a faint blue light that shimmered across the surface of the lake. For a moment, the valley was silent again, filled only with the gentle sound of wind moving through the grass and the soft breathing of the horses nearby. Ethan finally turned toward Ayana. Your grandmother helped someone she did not even know, he said. And now after all these years that kindness has found its way back here again. Ayana's expression carried a calm warmth that felt as steady as the land surrounding them. My grandmother always said that respect travels farther than fear ever could, she answered. When people choose understanding instead of suspicion, the world becomes a little wider for everyone who walks through it. The elder guided his horse back a few steps and looked across the valley one last time before addressing Ethan again. "This land will always belong to itself," he said. "But tonight you are welcome here as a guest, and as a friend whose family once shared a moment of trust with ours." Ethan inclined his head in quiet gratitude, understanding the meaning behind the simple words. The riders began to turn their horses slowly toward the shadowed trail that would lead them back toward the ridgeline, leaving the lake and the valley once again to the quiet presence of the night. Ethan stood beside Ayana, watching the last of the silhouettes fade into the moonlit canyon. Somewhere above them a hawk called softly in the darkness, and the wind carried the sound across the open basin. Ethan rested his hand lightly against the silver bracelet on his wrist and understood something that had not been clear to him before this day. Out on the frontier, many people believed the land was divided by fences, borders, and old fears. But standing beside the still water beneath the open sky, Ethan realized that sometimes the strongest bridge between two worlds begins with a single act of kindness remembered across time.